Welcome to another change-making conversation from Baptist News Global. You're listening to a special podcast series titled Highest Power, Church and State, featuring writer, poet, and musician Rick Pidcock. Now here's Rick.
David Easterwood is a pastor here. He is also the director of the field office for ICE in St. Paul. So someone who claims to worship God, teaching people in this church about God, is out there overseeing ICE agents. Think about what we've experienced. The murder of Renee Good at the hands of ICE. A Venezuelan national shot by ICE. A 6-month-old baby who almost died as a result of ICE unleashing military-grade weapons on our community. How dare you claim to be a pastor of God and you are involved in evil in our community?
Do you think Jesus would be understanding?
We're about worship.
These folks.
We're about spreading the love of Jesus.
But did you try to talk to them?
No, church had gathered for worship, which we do every Sunday, and we were interrupted by this group of protesters. Yeah. We asked them to leave, and they obviously have not left.
Protesters broke into City's Church, a Southern Baptist congregation in St. Paul, Minnesota, to expose one of their pastors, David Easterwood, who serves as the director of the St. Paul field office for ICE. One of the pastors responds by saying, "We're about spreading the love of Jesus." The church is also celebrating John Piper's 80th birthday and 20 years of church planting. So they're associated with the same ministry that supports Andy Naselli, the pastor I wrote about last week who prayed for God to break the teeth and cause to be stillborn those who won't submit to ICE. Still, they claim on their website, quote, "We are a community of Christians committed to worshiping Jesus, loving one another, and seeking the good of the Twin Cities," unquote. Seeking the good of the Twin Cities? Apparently, we have very different views of what it means to seek the good of your city. Because to conservative white evangelicals, seeking the good of your city apparently can mean getting rid of non-white people. If you think I'm being extreme, on the same day, the U.S. Department of Labor posted a picture of an all-white church congregation having a church picnic. They said, 250 years of one nation under God. Happy Sunday, America. The title of the painting was A Church Picnic by Arthur Sarnoff. The Trump administration has been posting pictures like this constantly throughout their second term, and the pictures are always filled with nothing but white people. They're trying to tell the story of an idealized past where everyone is peaceful, happy, and white, and everyone happily goes to church. When I was growing up in fundamentalist white evangelicalism, our Christian school teachers often told us that history is his story. The idea was that by studying history, we were studying the story that God had written. But because we were in Christian schools, this history was one of an idealized past, a perfect creation from which we fell, where settlers came to the United States for religious freedom and small government, and where we saved the Indians from their savagery and moved westward to become a city on a hill, a Christian nation in covenant with God, before the liberals came along. Of course, because of our framing, this story ultimately instilled in us the values of entitlement and colonization. And thus, God's story was considered to be a story of Christian entitlement and colonization. I covered some of this in more detail in episode 89. Sure, we were okay maybe admitting that one or two white people were mean to Native Americans, but overall, we thought we were fair and that ensuring Native American submission was ultimately for their good. Then apparently we didn't learn anything from that history because we went on to enslave black people. Then after the Civil War, we continued pushing segregation until the Civil Rights Movement. But again, apparently we haven't learned from history again because white evangelicals voted overwhelmingly for Donald Trump. And one of the reasons why they did was that Trump made them feel less bad about how they've benefited from the violence of their ancestors, and because Trump promised retribution on immigrants as well as on racial and ethnic minorities who white evangelicals think have a leg up on them. And now it's gotten so bad that the Trump administration's ICE agents are controlling people based on their accent.
Yes, you are required to. Where is safe?
Look, sir, are you going to do this the easy way or are we going to take you in?
You cannot take me in.
Yes,
I'm
I
in
can.
my private.
Yes, I can.
You
Do you have documentation?
I do have my
Can
documentation.
you present it to me,
Why are
please?
you asking me for my paperwork?
Because of your accent.
I still, you have an accent too.
Where were you born, sir?
Where were you born at?
Put your hands behind your back.
And if that weren't bad enough, they've actually arrested Native Americans in Minnesota. Here's an interview with Status Quo News about how ICE took 4 members of the Oglala Sioux tribe and now can't even locate 3 of them.
So these are 5 Oglala Sioux tribal council members, and they have 4. There was 4 tribal members who were picked up by ICE in a community called Little Earth right here in Minneapolis, St. Paul, and one of them has been released, but they couldn't locate the other 3. So the council members here, they're all elected officials of the Oglala Sioux tribe, and they gained access to the facility, and they couldn't find their 3 tribal members. They claim that they're not classifying them by their nationality, which tribal members are also citizens of the United States since 1924. You know, there's nobody more American than American Indians, but they were unable to find them here today, and so they're going to continue on. They got some contact information. They love the fact that you're here, that everybody's here, and they're going to be giving out tribal IDs to their tribal members who are in Minneapolis, St. Paul, at the American Indian Center down on Franklin Avenue. But I just want to say thank you to everyone that's here. Stay vigilant and stay assertive, stay constructive. We're in unprecedented times, the way that I see it. So
It's not lost on us that President Trump's favorite president, he has the painting on the wall, is Andrew Jackson.
That's the father of the Indian Removal Act. The fact that we're here at Fort Snelling, this is a concentration camp, a prison for Dakota people. Abraham Lincoln ordered the largest mass execution in American history. 38 plus 2 Dakota people were hung here, right here. And so it's not lost on us at all. In fact, it seems like a deliberate jab at the soul of our people, but we also have relatives. They don't understand that we are America. How could you possibly target Native Americans and with immigration and customs enforcement officers and then imprison us? That is impossible. It's legally impossible to do that.
It's Martin Luther King Jr. Day today, and given the fact that we apparently haven't learned from the civil rights leaders of our past, I wanted to speak with someone today who is covering and speaking into our modern injustices. Braxton Wade is a current Clemens Fellow with BNG. Some of you may recall I did the Clemens Fellowship with BNG along with Laura Ellis back in 2021. Wade is also a graduate of the University of Richmond and Chicago Theological Seminary. When Braxton was named as a Clemens Fellow, BNG Executive Director Mark Wingfield said, quote, "One of the highlights of our work at BNG is finding, nurturing, and giving experience to young writers who will be the future of our change-making conversations. Each of us, myself included, got a start because someone believed in us and gave us a chance to learn and write. We are thrilled to continue that tradition," unquote. Unfortunately, as in the case of Cities Church, white evangelical congregations and their pastors don't seem interested in hearing from those on the underside of power. Instead, they want to hold all the cards, talk down to the communities they're violently oppressing. So they need to be called out. Their tables need to be overturned. And this process needs to center the voices of those who are being harmed. So I sat down with Braxton to discuss a piece he wrote called "For Black History Month, Listening is More Important Than Speaking," and to ask for his perspective on how white Christian communities can listen to and learn from the men and women who understand our history, and how we've harmed and are continuing to harm those on the underside of power. You wrote a piece for BNG a year ago titled "For Black History Month, Listening is More Important Than Speaking." And you opened it up by talking about being a black pastor in a predominantly white space and in a predominantly white faith community. And then like during this year, as the year's gone on, we've seen the Trump administration systematically removing black people from their positions in government, removing reflection in museums and art on how white communities have treated black people historically, or even Native Americans. And so there's there's a sense, there's a real sense in which your experience as a black man in a predominantly white faith community is now paralleled by being a black man in a country that is predominantly run by white people. I'd be curious to hear what are some parallels or differences in how you've experienced white spaces in the church or white spaces in society at large.
Yeah, man. I hope you're ready to open the can of worms because here we go. I think that they've always paralleled if we're being really honest with ourselves. And I think in a lot of cases, not just in the Baptist world, but in the church world at large, um, white supremacy and racism has existed for a really long time. And I think the church has been a big part of perpetuating that within our small systems, but also across political scale. And we've taken the model of the government, we've inserted it into our churches, and vice versa. And if you go back to the 50s, specifically in the Baptist world, a church was a social club. And you would have folks smoking their cigars in the basement while they're a part of their bowling league. And it was very evident then, as it is today, that it remains a social club for a lot of folks. We want to hang out with the people who look like us, who think like us, who vote like us. We've chosen a side, and come hell or high water, that's the side we stick to. When I think about specifically within church spaces, how I've experienced racism as a black man is, man, that sermon was really loud, or you were really feeling it this morning. It could be as outward as that, or as inward as just a couple weeks ago, I was walking into church and I'm walking through the parking lot and I notice this person turns around, they make eye contact with me, and they proceed to lock their car about 3 or 4 times. It could be as minimal as that. A lot of times, Rick, it's come as you are and become as we are. And that's really tough to do when I have to change the color of my skin and the culture in which I was raised.
Yeah, that makes sense. In one of the things that you bring out in that piece is how black men in particular don't feel listened to. And you talk about listening well. And it's been interesting for me to cover different events for BNG in progressive churches because oftentimes I'll go there to do an article and there's a black speaker on the stage talking to an almost entirely white room. And like, I know we give white people a lot of grief and it's definitely well earned, but like, there's also something I appreciate about them being willing to sit there and listen. And so I'm curious, like, how have you experienced white communities listening? Are there some examples that have encouraged you, or are there ways in which white communities could listen better, even in the more progressive spaces?
Yeah, I think it's both and, right? And I think of 2 examples that come to mind. A couple years ago, I was speaking at an event for the Cooperative Baptist Fellowship of Virginia. And it was in Lynchburg, Virginia, of all places. And their executive coordinator, Mark Snipes, had invited us to go to dinner, to lunch beforehand. And I put the address into my GPS, and we arrive at Texas Roadhouse in Lynchburg, Virginia. And we walk in, we sit at a table, and very clearly, I begin to stick out like a sore thumb. We get through, the meal is very uncomfortable. We get through the meal, and on the way out, Mark looks me in the eye and says, "I'm so sorry. I didn't even think about how it might feel as a person of color to have to experience this. And I promise to do better." He took the moment to take a step out of his own self and to see it from a different person's perspective. And then I think about Courtney Allen Crump and Grace Baptist Church. And Courtney's a dear friend of mine now, but it was a couple years ago that they actually approached me and engaged with me in a conversation to lead around racism and justice within the church. And it was a sermon series that they actually went on. And I got to kick off the series leading a church-wide Sunday school class around racism in the church. And then got to preach that Sunday. And through this and through the hard work of Grace and the hard work of Courtney Allen Crump, the church ended up removing a photo of one of their pastors from the wall who had enslaved folks. He was an enslaver. And it's these beautiful moments where we see progressive churches do it right, where they listen well and they open themselves up to hear what the Spirit might be saying afresh. And then there are other spaces that are also progressive that are really struggling with that and struggling to do that well. Dr. King talks about the white liberal and makes a very large critique to the white liberal. And I think that us with ears to hear might want to hear afresh what Dr. King, the heart of what he's saying is that our practice doesn't always match our proclamation. And we have an opportunity as white spaces and or within white spaces to not just open our doors, but open our pulpits and open our ears and hearts to what the Spirit is saying afresh.
So one of the ways we do that is, and that you got into in your article, was talking about centering the voices of the oppressed in our work and amplifying their truths rather than speaking over them. And so, like, as you have gotten into journalism with Baptist News Global, you're doing the Clemens Fellowship with them right now. How do you see centering the oppressed being embodied in journalism, or how would you like to see that more embodied in journalism?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And like, I must first start by saying what an honor it is to follow the legacy of the Clemens and to be able to live into that. I also want to say that, Baptist News Global naming me a Clemens Fellow is centering the voice of the oppressed. And I want to tip my hat off not only to the board, but to Mark. And, you can look at Mark's whole life and his career, and it has been centering the voice of the oppressed. And I want to first start by saying that. Additionally, one of the initial conversations I had with Mark upon accepting the role here was, Mark, I'm going to be me. And yes, I'm going to learn how to do news articles. And I've already done some opinion pieces. And like, you're going to rip apart the fact that like I always want to insert my opinion in things. But I want to be authentic to who I am and to my voice and what's important to me. And his response was almost like, well, duh. Like, I don't want you to be anyone else. Like, I want you to be you. And Mark has really become an ally for me and sharing the stories of the oppressed and helping to name that, helping to live into my voice, helping to ensure that we're not white Baptist News Global, but we are Baptist News Global, and like living into that. And that has been one of the like honors so far in this work, is that I'm learning that stories matter, and my story in partnership with the folks that I'm writing with or about matters. And it has opened my eyes to the broader sense of what it might look like to center the voice of the oppressed. And how do we do that within
the like global context of Baptist News Global, but also you have writers like you and I who come from different walks of life who want to write about different things, and living into that freedom to be able to do that, while also being aware enough to the situations that's happening in life to write about things that are relevant.
Yes. One thing I thought was really interesting that you did in your piece was a voice that you brought into your piece was Molly Robinson, and you quoted her saying, "My passion for my work isn't rooted solely in race. It's about the dignity of humankind. Everyone deserves to be treated fairly and equally, and their voice matters." And I love that quote because I think it really helps us as we're trying to choose like which voices do we bring out and highlight for particular stories. And one thing that it kind of reminded me of was in the worship space, worship lyrics in white evangelical churches, they use a lot of the word I a lot. And it's often, if you examine it, it's this expression of an individualistic commodification and colonization. But in the spirituals, the word I was also used a lot, but it was used to emphasize the dignity of humankind and the union of the community. And so I'm curious, like, how do you see the dignity and community of humanity better emphasized in marginalized communities that can recognize the power dynamics that are at play here than in the dominant white spaces of religion and society?
Yeah, Rick, that's a great question, and I think the quote that I pulled out from Molly has helped shape how I write and helped shape how I live into being a Christian. When I think about like the distinction that you brought up, not many folks would have even noticed that, and so I appreciate you calling that out. It's one of the first things I noticed in working in predominantly white church spaces is there is a individualistic mentality that is also tied to colonization, and it was one of the hardest things for me to wrestle with when I stepped into white spaces, because within the Black space and specifically within marginalized communities, loving our neighbor hasn't ever been a question. I think back to we used to get home from school early, and our neighbor would ensure that we made it home. And it was never a question whether or not she was going to do that. It was just the way life happened. I think back to the meals we would share at a table growing up. My mom always had an extra plate made. And I remember one day I asked her why, and she said, because you never know who's going to show up. And lo and behold, my sister would bring home misfits who didn't have food to eat, and they would have space at our table. They would have home and communion with us. Later in life, my mom decided to homeschool us, and it moved from just being our family that was homeschooled to my mom had taken on these students who were struggling with traditional school. And so what moved from 4 people ended up being 20 something by the end of it, all that we were helping to fund because it was the community. We took that idea of I am because you are, like that Ubuntu, and we made it into practice. And when you look at marginalized communities, that has forever been a part of the structure of who we are. When I think about some of my Latinx friends, like that is, community is so important. And how you play your role within community is really important. And you learn that at a really early age. And for me, there was something I learned really early that I had to wrestle with on the other side of being in predominantly white spaces is, oh, we're all playing a game and we're playing a game to win for ourselves. It doesn't matter if anyone else wins or not. And I think, that has been quite fascinating to be able to step into a place as a pastor and try to help shape a culture that mirrors more of the community within the marginalized community than the community that we have, the community that white churches have perpetuated for a really long time.
Yeah. And when you're participating in that community, obviously sometimes, especially in a nation where there's a lot of white supremacy, you're going to have civil rights conversations come up. And today, when this conversation goes out, it's MLK Day, and we're seeing so many civil rights being violated or dismissed as unimportant today. Is there anything in particular that you learned from MLK that you might want to share that informs how you approach telling the stories we're experiencing today in your journalism?
Yeah. I've looked up to MLK for a long time. I realized early on in my life that I was called to proclaim the gospel. What I've learned from his life into today in journalism is that words matter and stories matter. And, one of the things I've done every year for about the last 8 years is I choose a letter from Dr. King or a sermon, and I really wrestle with the text. And in almost all of his sermons, he tells these stories of a people who didn't have much, a people who were oppressed. But the line that runs through almost every one of his stories and through every one of his letters and sermons is hope. Hope in a God that hasn't abandoned us here, and hope in a people that won't give up and won't let go. And so my hope in my writing is that in every piece that I write a message of hope, because the world needs it and I need it. And when I think about his life, and when I think about the life of my family that lived during Dr. King's time, and I think about everything that they've seen between now and then, I think they're seeing things today that we never thought we would ever open the lid back on. We're seeing people treat it in a way that we never thought imaginable again. And there's one thing my great grandmother told me around Christmas. And she said, "You got to keep on keeping on." And I think the only way we do that is to hear messages of hope, but also messages that move us into action. And I hope in my writing throughout this fellowship that you hear the invitation to receive hope, but also the challenge to take hope back out into the world and go do something about it.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And I think sometimes when we hit on days like this, like MLK Day or Black History Month, especially in a lot of these predominantly white spaces, they can get dismissed as privileging Black people. You'll often hear them ask jokingly, "Why don't we have a White History Month?" And on the other hand, there's also some ways where these days or months can become commodified by corporations. We see this a lot, in Pride Month, and I know a lot of LGBTQ people or other marginalized communities who they appreciate the willingness to listen on one hand, but then kind of roll their eyes at the corporate marketing culture of it all. So, how do you see these days and months that emphasize justice being helpful for the oppressed? And do you have any thoughts on how we can avoid the marketing and commodification, that capitalism brings to marginalized people in doing so?
Yeah. Look, I think the way I feel about it is we're going to take it because it's ours and we're not giving anything back. And so MLK Day, Black History Month, Juneteenth, those are ours and we're not giving them back. They're not yours to reclaim. On the other side of that, I think the way that we we help from the corporate greed or the capitalistic greed, and how we stop falling into that is we build into the culture of our communities, the culture of our churches, the culture of our congregations, the culture even of our friends, where we listen to them more than just a month out of the year. I think back to a church friend who reached out to me and they said, "Hey, I really need someone to speak during Black History Month. I need a black preacher." And I was busy that day, and they're like, "You're the only Black preacher right now," and that's a problem. And I think like we have to build a culture, for 51 weeks out of the year, we don't have Black preachers, but man, Black History Month, we've got to have someone. It's the same thing with women in ministry, right? You pick a marginalized group and you can talk about how we have to build within the system and the culture of who we are. These checkpoints where we stop and say, hey, have we tokenized these people? And what does it look like for us to build this within the culture of who we are? And it's one thing I've even done within my friend group to say, who am I hanging out with? Am I hanging out with a diverse group of folks? Am I hanging out with people who are going to sound like an echo chamber for me? What are the different perspectives? And it has helped change who I am as a person and helped open my heart up more to different things. And if your congregation, if your context, if your friend group is only going to hear from a Black voice on MLK Day or Black History Month, if you're just going to get a little info video on Juneteenth for your corporation, it's never going to change the culture of who you are. It's going to take that consistent message, that consistent presence to breed empathy. And I think ultimately that's what we need to do in this world, is we need to find ways to be more empathetic when it's not convenient, right? And I think, Renee Good, tragic situation. And we can name 30 other folks who died in ICE, at the hands of ICE or in ICE detention centers. But the country is reacting to a white woman because we haven't changed the culture within the country to care about people on the margins. And us taking MLK Day off isn't going to change that, right? And so we need that today more than ever.
Well, I appreciate the work that you're doing in this space to help bring out some of those voices. And I love your thoughts here. I'd love to have you back again to discuss some of this more. So thanks for coming on and spending some time with us today.
Of course. Thank you. I appreciate the work you're doing.
That's it for today. Thank you so much for listening. Please like, subscribe, and rate us on your favorite podcast platform. And we'll be back with another episode on Thursday.
This has been another change-making conversation from Baptist News Global. The episode you've just heard is part of a special podcast series titled Highest Power, Church and State. Be sure to follow BNG daily at baptistnews.com and subscribe to get notifications about future episodes. Baptist News Global is a national nonprofit news service that is independent, free, and faithful. BNG is supported by readers and listeners like you. Learn more at baptistnews.com.
This episode was produced and edited by Mac Bowles of TKG Communications, LLC, Dallas, Texas.